Our next panel is on legal and regulatory risk. It's being moderated by my friend Andrea Tinianow, which is the name that is close, with the Global Business Blockchain Council, which is one of the largest industry organizations in the world focused on crypto. Rudnick is a member of it, and we're going to be looking at this from a cross-Atlantic perspective. I think this is going to be a fabulous panel, and I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks so much. Andrea Tinianow with Global Blockchain Business Council. I'm a Delaware attorney, and I've been in the space since about 2015 and 16, and I launched the Delaware Blockchain Initiative. So that's how I got in. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just share, their name and what they're doing.
Thank you very much. My name is Goncalo Lima. I'm part of the R3 team. I look after capital markets strategy. Before that, I was at Standard Chartered Bank as a CEO for Rates and FX, and I'm looking forward to discuss DAOs after lunch, so hopefully we make it interesting to all of you.
Hi everyone, I'm Hailey Lennon, a partner at Rudnick. I started my career at Silvergate Bank back in 2014, was in-house at Silvergate, Coinbase, and Bitflyer, so some of the centralized exchanges here in the US.
Hi everyone, I'm Rodford, so CEO, co-founder of Archax. Thanks Andrea and Rudnick for inviting me along here. I spent 20 years in asset management, got interested in crypto in 2013. In 2018, decided it was all going to be regulated, so set up Archax with my co-founders. Spent 5 years building it, and we're the UK's first regulated digital securities exchange, custodian broker, and the UK's first registered crypto asset company.
Hi, I'm Amanda Wick, also very excited to be here. My path to crypto was a little different. I was a money laundering federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice, who prosecuted crypto money launderers starting in 2013. And later left the government, went to Chainalysis, did a stint on the Hill for the US House of Representatives, and then left last year to found the Association for Women in Cryptocurrency, which is a professional association that advocates for greater inclusion in the industry for women.
Thanks so much. So a little housekeeping before we get started. This is the panel, but you're all part of the conversation. I can't see everybody. In fact, the light is so bright, but we really want to include everybody here. So we will be discussing novel issues, novel legal issues, novel regulatory issues raised by decentralized systems, by blockchain, by crypto. But if we're talking about something and you've got something you want to say, just raise your hand and we'll bring you in. But you'll have to speak loudly. I think maybe there's even someone with a mic walking around. So just to get started, one of the things that I think has captured all of our imagination is the concept of an organization where it's completely decentralized and everybody involved has the ability to vote, to make rules, to decide if there's a treasury, how to spend that treasury. And of course, I'm talking about something we call a DAO, right? DAO. But before we get started, we're certainly cognizant of the fact that there may be people here who don't know what a DAO is. So we want you to raise your hands if you don't know. No, I'm only kidding. Really, please do not raise your hands. We wanted to make sure that...
That was not nice.
What was that?
That was not nice.
No, I'm like I said,
there was a brave soul in the back who I'm like, solidarity.
No. So we want to talk about this because this is sort of a thing. And so it's called a DAO. And like I said, DAOs there are all different kinds of DAOs. DAOs for charitable purposes, DAOs, like I said, for investment purposes. And so the question is really, if we think about, there is something called this, and for most DAOs, the DAO is actually an online framework where people can use tokens to vote, and they can vote on proposals, and then as a result of the voting with the tokens, either something happens off-chain or it happens on-chain. But the idea is that you've got a group of people, and they have tokens, and they get to vote. So we're gonna be talking about this organization called a DAO. And before we get started, I know there are some of you, I've spoken to all the people in the panel, some of them have very strong feelings about DAOs. I think it's kind of cool. I think they're kind of like partnerships. But I want to start out with Amanda, because you have some strong feelings, but really I want to get everybody's take, because everybody's coming from a different perspective. So
you went with the spiciest first, because she knows I'm not a fan of the concept. And that's only because when you're a prosecutor and your life consists of trying to find justice for people who have been wronged, the concept of a group that has chosen to come together without limiting their liability legally means that you're all liable, because if not, no one can't be liable. Like if you do something, the idea that you're going to have this decentralized autonomous organization if it does something bad, if you're in it, you're going to want somebody else to be responsible. And if you're not in it and you're the one who's screwed, you're going to want somebody to be responsible. That's how humanity works. And so sometimes my frustration with crypto, and it's been like a decade now, is they love to say kind of like, oh, we're going to do this and it's new and nobody's ever seen it. And I'm like, no, that's actually a money services business. You calling it a widget doesn't mean it's not the transmission of money, right? And so we have to kind of be conscious. I think that sometimes the industry's like, oh, we've developed this new thing. And I kind of feel like, no, it's not a new thing. You've just suddenly decided to take the limited liability out of a partnership, which I think lawyers in the room would say that was a galactically stupid idea after the invention of LLPs. So I find
So
that,
Amanda,
yeah.
what you're saying is you think, you don't like DAOs because you think that the folks participate in it are going to try to eliminate liability. It's harder for the law enforcement to reach, and the people who are part of it are going to say, we don't have.
Well, not just law enforcement, but if you just think about like activities of a group, right? And if you do something wrong, if you wrong somebody, somebody's gonna, whether it's criminal or civil, somebody's going to want whoever's responsible to be held accountable. And the idea that you're just going to decentralize responsibility, I don't know how you would do that. And a lot of my problem, not just with crypto, with the world is, we don't seem to be good as a society at worst case scenario planning. And so if you just for a moment think of the worst case scenario of a DAO, what is your plan for if it does something wrong? And if there's a good answer to that, I will be a convert 100%.
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I was going to add, I mean, as practicing attorney, when you are, representing a DAO or individuals part of a DAO for potential wrongdoing and enforcement action and investigation by the SEC, something like that, the SEC or any regulator is going to look at this DAO and still see the roles that people were playing within the DAO. And it is sort of human nature that people start to take on a CFO type role or a chief operating officer type role. And even if they aren't using those titles, regulators are still looking to figure out who was in control, who was making decisions. The idea of a DAO is that there's, voting mechanisms and governance, and so maybe it's all the individuals that are involved in that, but usually there's still a core group of people in any sort of decentralized organization. And I think the point you made, attorneys are fans of the corporate structures that exist because it brings clarity and limitation to liability, whereas a DAO, you've just sort of thrown away, centuries of law that's in place to.
But real quick though, because worst case scenario planning is critical to what Hailey just said, think about how a group usually runs. So I run a nonprofit. We were trying to prevent women with full-time jobs from volunteering with us. We can't stop them from wanting to get involved because they're passionate. Think about a DAO. Who is most likely to want to be the most involved? The people who care the most, who want it to be the best. If that's a minority and the majority does something terrible, now the factual scenario that a regulator comes in and sees is this small group of people who love this and tried to do well should now be responsible for the bad of the many, which is, I think, a point that is the next step of if Hailey's right, then what?
So I'm going to ask Goncalo, because I know you've been doing some deep thinking on this subject.
Not deep, a bit of thinking, but I think we already have a lot of associations, for example, that have representation of different people, and the risk of capture is definitely one. And you then, if someone captures it, is no longer decentralized. So you go back to a centralization aspect. So why do you need it? Of course, on my day-to-day job, I don't use too much of that. We deal with centralized organizations. We like some concepts of decentralization, and one of the key aspects with the institutions that we work with, and some of them are similar to Archax and so on, the issue is what risks are we talking about, and how do we mitigate some of the risks, and how do we accept the risks that we can't mitigate fully. And for a DAO, I think it's very difficult for any of those institutions that we are used to deal with, for them to get comfortable to invest in DAOs, to allow for, how do you go to an investment committee and say, can you invest in this? How do you create the DAO in the first place? But it's an evolution, so I think we are not ready yet, and hopefully these debates will help people start thinking about it. But the LLC concept was a new one a few years back, and so the DAOs will go that way. I think probably it will take a bit of time for institutions to move faster around this space.
So I want to ask Brandon, because you have a centralized exchange, right? And we were joking, we're like, oh, you're going to turn that exchange into a DAO? And I'm just like, what's your take? Just
Yeah, I think no one likes an agreeable panel, but the guys, I agree with the points. Amanda's point earlier about people who have this tendency in the space to think they've created something new and it already exists. Like, I think that's so true of the industry. This idea that crypto asset is its own asset class is ridiculous to me. For the most part, the assets already exists, and the crypto piece is just a digital representation of the ownership of that asset. And so when I start looking at DAOs and people have voting tokens, I go, okay, it looks like voting equity to me. And the concept that someone can set up an organization and say, you know what, let's just ignore every law and piece of regulation that's been put in place to protect consumers and prevent crime seems ludicrous. And the fact that loads of as a bit of an aside, the fact that loads of private equity and VCs pile into these companies that could be financing crime, slavery, whatever it is around the world drives me crazy.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry, but I think maybe we need to change the title of the panel, because maybe there aren't any new novel legal issues, right? Maybe it's really the same issues out there, and we're just thinking, or maybe
we're building the same thing again. The regulations were there for a lot of these asset classes, and for the DAOs, we shouldn't lose the technology. The technology is great. There's some great things to be done, but of course you need a responsible party. There's a reason there's a senior manager regime or a governance body to prevent some of these issues happening.
So I'm going to throw something back. In the US, some of you may know that there were two DAOs that have been sued. One was sued by the CFTC, one of our regulators in the US, and one that was recently sued by class action. And in one suit, in the first suit, the CFTC said, well, I'm going to sue the DAO by, I'm going to be holding responsible not all the token holders, but just those token holders that participated in governance. Okay, you go, okay, well, maybe that makes sense. And then they also said that, and by the way, those token holders are joint and severally liable. So they're all liable, all liable. But then in the class action that was recently filed in the private class action, the plaintiff said, well, it's not just the token holders who may have participated in governance, it's all the token holders, and by the way, they're all general partners. Yeah, so that's where we are in that lawsuit. So it doesn't seem like we have a uniformity in who do we hold responsible for DAOs, and is a DAO really just a general partnership? I mean, Brandon, I think you'd probably say since you might say yeah, or
well, I think everyone agrees someone should be responsible. I think everyone agrees it can't be nobody. And in the UK, like, we've been pushing that, even if you think it's a DAO, someone at the start decided to set this thing up, and you should follow them. And some people point to the developers or the foundations. The developer might be the founder, they might be the senior manager, and then they're responsible. But usually, if you follow the person that benefited the most, you'll find a responsible party. So in the absence of anything else, I'd say, okay, whose idea was it to set this thing up? And
whose idea was it to set up the person with the idea? Yeah.
I will say, just to argue against myself, because you made a point that kind of stuck with me, was one of the frustrations of prosecuting entities, right, is so often it's very difficult to get to the top. Like, it's very hard to get to the people that you know are most responsible, because obviously they're kind of, it's just, you're ending up with like middle people, lower people. But I wouldn't have a problem with the DAO if the agreement was all for one and one for all. Everybody is responsible. Every token holder is equally responsible. You're joining this with the idea that we're all in this and we're jointly and severally liable. Then I would say, well, that's actually a really intriguing thing. Because if you believe in something so much that you're willing to be involved and you're all willing to spread the liability, then that's actually a model that's not as terrible as some corporations and LLPs, where the people who are actually responsible are never held responsible and the lower people are. So the cynic in me is kind of like, I would love to see a DAO.
Well, some of them have charters, though. I mean, some of them do have, and especially if they're wrapped, right? That's another concept. So you could have a DAO, and then you say, well, we have this DAO, but we're really going to, say all the members of the DAO are members of, let's say, a limited liability company. It's called the concept of like wrapping your DAO in a corporate structure.
Well, and what's interesting too with this technology is it's all recorded and accessible, right? These decisions and the voting mechanisms
On
are
the
happening
blockchain.
through on the blockchain and snapshot records. So you can sort of see the way the DAO is operating and making decisions and who's participating. But then again, most of the members are usually anonymous, and regulators are then trying to figure out who is behind and where in the world they're located.
Right. So what's interesting, it seems what we're saying is when you have these decentralized systems, all of us, we want to hold somebody responsible. And what another trend we're seeing, novel issue, is whether or not, and this was raised to some extent in an earlier panel, is whether or not we can hold, or the courts will hold developers, right, responsible for certain damages incurred by token holders, right? So our coders on blockchains, are they somehow responsible? Do they have, let's say, do they owe fiduciary duties? Do they owe duties of care? And we've got these two cases. One, the tulip trading case, which was discussed earlier, and this other one, this case that I referred to before, the plaintiff's class action case. And that's the law. Does fiduciary duty law, does that should coders be liable under? Should they be a fiduciary to the token holders? That's a very high bar. I mean, yeah. You're saying could token holders in a DAO have limited liability? Well, I think here's the thing. I mean, I think right now the regulators and the courts are finding general partnerships. So that would be a big no, right? No. On the other hand, you could set up a corporate structure. You could set up something that looks like a limited partnership or some other kind of LLC, which potentially you could even get really technical and have series LLCs perhaps, and every token holder is a series, but I don't even want to get there, which would limit liability. You could use all sorts of fancy corporate structures to limit liability, but if you just have like your plain vanilla DAO and token holders, do we have a hand in the back? And then we've got another hand. This is good. Okay.
Hi. Just thinking about that, if you're saying it's a fiduciary duty on the tulip thing, surely the structure doesn't matter. You know, if I set up a structure that sort of gives me limited liability, but with foreseeable, you know, I've gone and done something stupid that kills you, I'm still liable, aren't I?
Well, I think that's just wants to take. I think you're saying if you're a coder and you do something stupid and it kills you, it depends. I mean, was there intent? Was there, right? I mean, you have to look at what's the theory of liability here? What's if you do something stupid, was it intentional? Was it negligent? Right? Foreseeability, yeah.
So that's actually a really interesting point, because one of the things that fascinates me about the tulip trading case is that anybody who says that when they invented crypto didn't see the foreseeability of hacks, scams, and thefts, and the problem of not being able to get that funding back would be an unmitigated moron, right? Like, I don't even know who would say that you didn't see the possibility of stealing software. So to me, and we've discussed this a little bit, the fascinating thing about tulip trading is that a lot of times when folks invented this, they treated it like widgets and not the creation of a new method of financial services, which is terrifying in its own, impact. But the reality of self-hosted, unhosted wallets is that we don't have anything else on the planet where law enforcement can know where your funds are as a victim and has no mechanism for getting them. And some companies will say, oh, we can hack ledgers, we can do this. But realistically, there are funds that are sitting that people know that we watch, and we can see the funds move. Sometimes they just sit there for years. And somebody last night was saying, well, but doesn't that ruin the immutability of the blockchain? Because this is literally its whole thing. Except, did you break something broken when you never built in the fact that there's not a mechanism to make people right, to make people whole?
But Amanda, but there are lots of situations where we know something's been stolen, whether it's jewels, whether it's money, and it's sitting somewhere and you can't get to it because you don't have the ability. So I wouldn't say this is the only.
But this is the question. If you have the technological capability, say that they're able to do something with consensus, where all of a sudden, right, the miners agree that, okay, we've done it for forks, right? Like forks exist. They decide that, okay, we're going to build into and I'm not a tech person, so I'm getting heavy out over my skis. Tech people, feel free to correct me. But say they build something into the mempool that allows a change where if you obtain a court order from some valid court, you could actually reverse this and give people back their money. Think about now how viable this makes this as an alternative to TradeFi. Think about all of the haters who would be instantly quashed. Like, think about, and I know, oh, it's immutable, but immutable in the sense that it's not wrong, not immutable in the sense that it can't be changed by consensus with correct information. And I think it's a really interesting question.
I think this is interesting, and I think the devil's in the details. What's the governance? Who determines what is a authorized court order from what country? And we have a question.
Yeah, just on DAOs, I have met an investor once who said, "Oh, I'd like to buy 15% of that DAO. Can you do that for me because it's renewables, recyclables, and it would look good on my LinkedIn page and my CV? So can you do that?" And I just thought, well, you want to own 15% of this distributed autonomous organization? How distributed is it if you can buy 15% of it?
That's a big question.
If we come back across to this side of the Atlantic in terms of corporate structure, there is something called a UK, and I'm not a corporate lawyer, limited by guarantee,
Sure.
where it's one member, one share,
Yep.
which has existed for a long, long time. Could we not just use that and call it a DAO, where one person gets one vote and you don't get to own 15%?
Well, you're talking about, what you're talking is the corporate structure. So you could set something up as a limit, but then you've got that one member, right? And that one member would be responsible, Right. Yeah. I mean, you could. That's how you would use a corporate wrapper.
I mean, one thing about DAOs that I've thought of early on is, having a corporate structure, a traditional corporate structure, and then a DAO layered on top. There's definitely, I mean, for one, I think DAOs were sort of a buzzword, right? Like a way to get and promote community involvement and make individuals feel like they're part of the decision making. But, Stephen Pally and I talk often about, should those decisions be something that's true to like the core of the business, or should it be something a little bit more superficial, like what the logo looks like, or things like that, where you're still drumming up community involvement, you're getting the community involved and excited about the project, but you're not also throwing aside all of the corporate protections.
Yeah.
You have
no,
that
I think.
in some football tokens that exist right now, like Chills and Socios, where people get to vote on the flavour of the pies, the halftime music, like the things that don't really matter in the grand scheme. You still have the corporate and the governance, and separating. You could have a DAO as a product that's still overseen by governance with very defined terms of reference. This is what can be decided. And just on the comment earlier as well, and with the structures and everything, that also presupposes we know who these people are. A lot of these tokens are pinging around the world with anyone owning them, to convince everyone to sign a legal contract in their jurisdiction where perhaps they have to set up a structure or identify themselves. Like, that's a way away. The second we start saying to everyone you have to do AML KYC, that already seems a big problem in the crypto space.
That's right. Please.
I think what is interesting, and going back to Graham's point, is there's a lot of applications of these concepts into the corporate structure that we now see. For example, for voting in AGMs, there's a lot of things being done on the back of the shares that are inspired or could be parallel to the DAO construct. So there's a lot of concepts that we can use without having to go all the way to a decentralized autonomous organization. There's probably two problems there, which is the decentralized and the autonomous part of it. But I think in terms of concepts and getting inspired from this technology to apply it to the corporate structures that we see, it's usually how institutions that we deal with look at, and regulators probably as well. So this point that you were making, that the regulators are trying to see who's the COO, who's the CFO on these things, it just means that for you to regulate it, you need to try to find the bridges between what the corporate structure is and you can use today and the new things that technology brings. But you have a lot of experience there.
Yeah, no, I think to your point and the cases we've mentioned, the regulators are looking at, is there an executive team? Are the voters the individuals that sort of promoted what occurred? I mean, you just are trying to look for who
has control.
Who has control,
and that's the theme that permeates all of corporate law, securities law. Who had control? Who are the decision makers? They're going to say, you're right, to your point, if somebody owns 15% of the tokens, they will.
They're gonna benefit
There'll
from-
be a likely a finding that somebody who owns 15% and voting those and carries the day, and they will likely be found to have control. You're going to say?
I don't want to say something too controversial, but I will say that I feel like the conversation and the questions point out something that at a lawyers' conference I think we can say, which is that it's great when you have lawyers who are thinking about responsible innovation and what that looks like. And when they talk about this is the history and this is the law, and these are the things that you need to consider. I think the frustrations of those of us who have been in this for a decade and watched some of these creators and these founders go to a lawyer and get the advice that they needed but didn't want, and then toddled down the street and went to a different lawyer and got similar advice, and then toddled down the street and got similar advice, and just kept going until they found somebody who would tell them what they wanted to hear, who gave them an opinion that allowed them to be wildly irresponsible in what they were innovating, and would hand out letters saying this isn't a security.
But Amanda, this isn't new to crypto. I mean, we have irresponsible people in every industry.
Yes, 100%.
And we also have lawyers in every industry, unfortunately, no one in this room, who may not give the best, advice or the most thoughtful.
And I'm not saying there's a percentage of, I'm not saying it's the lawyer's fault. I'm saying that, well, the ones that were giving crappy advice, it's absolutely their fault. But the ones, but we have to, somebody earlier said on one of the panels, like, we really need this industry to grow up and mature. And I think a lot of us are hoping that some of these folks are in that what got us here won't get us there. And we're there, and we're really hoping that some of that will change so that when a lawyer says, this is actually not that different, and everything about this looks like control, and these are the problems you're likely going to face, they listen, and they don't just go down the street
Amanda,
and do what they want to do.
I want to push back, and I want to ask the group here. In the US, there are a lot of folks who say, well, we don't have regulatory clarity. In fact, here in the UK and in the EU, I think there's some pretty responsible regulation that's being developed. Mm-hmm. In the US, we see something far different than that, right? So it could be that, in the US, you had lawyers who were going out on a limb because they were aspirational, they wanted it. I mean, and maybe that's why if they gave the opinion letter that, well, this token's a security, so you can't do what you want, so maybe they went, and a lot of the innovation that happened in the US, I mean, it happened, and now the innovators are getting slammed. So, I mean, in the UK and in the EU, we're seeing some pretty nice regulation being developed,
yes,
right?
With MiCA
Right.
So yes, but it's not perfect, and I think it's experimentational as well. But it has a lot of good concepts.
There's a lot there because the financial intermediaries,
Exactly,
right?
financial intermediaries, the CASPs and the VASPs and so on. And in addition, it puts a lot of the onus back to the issuers, which in itself can cause some.
You said the issuer.
The issuer.
Right, and as we know, in a decentralized ecosystem, is there always an issuer? Exactly. Not so much. So there's a lot of.
So it's a good step in the right direction, but still there's roles that this technology could introduce that are unclear. But I'm sure the rest of the panel will have. And there's a question there.
I just wanted the panel's view on how this is different to all of the law around open source.
Can you speak up, please, Justin?
Sorry, so I just wanted the panel's view on how this is different to open source. So no one at Facebook found someone to blame when their service went down because open source code didn't work, right? It was buyer beware, use it at your own risk. Obviously, this is money, so there is a regulatory element, but I'd be interested in their view on, this being a solved problem in that for decades, Bill Gates famously, wrote his contracts for software that said, effectively, before you read them, you accepted them. When you tore open the packaging, you accept Microsoft software. No one blames architectural software when a building falls down. It has no liability. Mm-hmm. Why is this different?
Well, I think, kind of back to that point earlier about a lot of the law already exists. I'd say it's probably the same. So when we became regulated, we have to have our system in place, all the counterparties, and you undertake, these are the systems we're using, we've performed appropriate due diligence, and we're standing behind them. And if the market goes down, I might be using someone else's market tech, but I'm still the responsible party for it. And kind of back to Andrea's point as well on, the regulation and everything. From the start, Archax has kind of said the regulation is already there. When we went to the FCA pre the consultation, we said to them, look, we think whether a security has its ledger on a bit of paper, on Excel, or on a blockchain, it's still a security. So all of this regulation still exists. and we can follow it. They agreed with us completely. And actually, I think it made it more confusing in the first time when they came out with the crypto asset registration, because then it kind of bucketed everything together. And I think we still do it today. We talk about crypto assets like it's one thing. It's a technology layer for any asset. So probably to your question, I suspect, and I'm not familiar with open source law per se, is that whatever exists then probably still exists now. If I use a bit of software, I'm responsible for it. If I build a bit of software, I'm responsible for it. And to the extent it causes financial harm, it's probably on me and not my coders.
I will say I think it's a really fantastic question that gets to a layer of a level of societal analysis that we don't talk about very often, which is that we don't really have a problem if somebody uses software and the ramifications aren't huge. I mean, if you use software and there's a problem with it, like if you think about like the ramifications of that bad, but not necessarily life-shattering. When you're talking about money services, now the ramifications of buyer beware is effectively social Darwinism. We haven't historically been okay with that because most countries, especially outside of the US, have some kind of social safety net and believe in the concept of there should be a floor below which we are not comfortable with people treating each other, right? If I steal your money, there should be a system for getting it back. It shouldn't be, well, it's buyer beware. You were dumb enough to put your money in DeFi, and when it got hacked, lo siento mucho. We don't really do that. We don't really have the concept of, well, and it's weird when you think about it because we're okay with gambling. If somebody walked out of a casino and said, oh, I lost my life savings on red, you'd be like, I mean, the building said casino.
People do say that crypto is really a form of gambling, right? I was actually at a meeting in Delaware with a bunch of judges, bankruptcy judges and lawyers. And someone there said to me, like, I don't really get it, Andrea. Like, isn't this just another form of gambling? I mean, why do we even need new rules about this? Why, you know?
I mean, we have I'll just say we have law enforcement in the United States. It's a problem. There's a crime called pig butchering, which I don't want to spend a time explaining it, but I highly encourage you to look it up because it's like a scourge on the planet right now, especially for the EU, UK, Canada, the US. People are literally losing their life savings, committing suicide like it's horrible. And we have law enforcement when people come in who say, well, you voluntarily gave them your money. Even though it's fraud like anything else, even though it's no different than if it was a TradeFi scam, because it's crypto, they treat it like it was a buyer beware situation.
And that actually raises an interesting point, I think, that Hailey, you wanted to make. And that had to do with the way banks are treating crypto, right? And the risk, and especially in the US.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to hear what's happening here, but I know that you had some thoughts about.
Yeah, I just, I started my career at Silvergate Bank. It's been interesting to me to see the progression of traditional finance systems in the United States, you know, start to get more comfortable with cryptocurrency businesses. Then we had Brian Brooks at the OCC putting out guidance. And then recently we had this wave of, you know, Silvergate Bank, Signature Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, seeing a lot of regulatory pressure in some ways and having to close their doors. I mean, the way I look at what's going on in the United States is there are two ways to attack a new industry. It's through the banking partnerships and this idea that as long as a company is, you know, legally in business, a legitimate business purpose, that they should have access to financial institutions. And it's ironic because Bitcoin was sort of created for the reason of becoming a financial system for the unbanked or underbanked. Now cryptocurrency is the underbanked, you know, we're losing bank accounts. The second way to start sort of attacking the technology in the United States is these centralized exchanges. How, you know, people newer to the industry are coming on to Coinbase, these different exchanges, and starting to buy cryptocurrency and learn about it.
Right.
And we saw the Bittrex news a few days ago. So, you know, it's been a hard few months in
right.
crypto.
I just want to say, so for those of you who may not know, in the US, in the last, I think, week or two, one exchange, a smaller exchange, has been sued by the SEC, Bittrex, and another exchange, Coinbase, one of the largest in the world, received what's called a Wells notice, which means they're probably going to be sued. And
Don't forget the CFTC complaint against Binance.
Oh yeah, and there's a CFTC complaint against not Binance US, but global Binance, another. So what you're saying is, you know, the exchanges are coming under attack, and the banks have been told basically that crypto's too risky.
Well, and what's novel about it is, you know, as an attorney in the space for years, we've had clients coming to us talking about these proposed ICOs. You know, the name alone should raise some questions about if security laws are implicated. So I'm certainly not up here arguing that most of the cryptocurrencies out there aren't securities, but the SEC was doing enforcement actions, you know, one by one against token projects. Now going after an exchange and saying, you know, it started with the Coinbase insider trading case, the Wahi case, where they listed 9 cryptocurrency assets and said, you as an employee were doing insider trading of these cryptocurrency securities. Here are the 9 we're listing, and there's probably more. And the SEC did something similar in the Bittrex case where they said, you should have been a registered broker-dealer, there's these 6 tokens, but there's probably more, this is not
And they don't sue
list.
and they don't sue the token
Exactly.
they don't bring, I mean, in the Bittrex case, they're suing Bittrex, but in the Wahi case, they didn't sue Coinbase, they just sued the ex-employee
Right,
and his friend.
so you're going to an exchange and saying, you list these 6 security offerings and you're not a broker-dealer. What they're also saying is, hey, you token issuers, you have an unregistered security, but they're choosing a very weird way to go about
Very
it.
strange.
And you know, I was speaking with a group last night. You know, hopefully, what this means, Coinbase certainly does. Bittrex may. Some of these exchanges may actually start to push back and start to force the SEC to prove their argument, and at least that would bring some clarification to the United States at the very least.
Yeah, so we're starting to see some clarification. There's a bankruptcy case that everyone should look at, and I'm going to forget what it was. The Voyager bankruptcy, where the bankruptcy judge refused to find that certain tokens were in fact securities. But in the last 4 minutes, I would just love everyone down the line. What are we going to be talking about in, let's say, 5 years? What are the legal issues? What are the
I will come back just briefly on the what the other institutions are
Sure.
doing, because we spoke a lot about Binance's.
You know what? I want to hear that.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you?
Yes, I really
Can I?
do.
Yeah,
Please.
good. What I'm seeing, and probably Graham has the same thoughts, is that a lot of the traditional banks are actually investing in this space. You see a BNY buying Fireblocks or buying a stake there. You see a Goldman's very active, JP Morgan and so on. So a lot of the incumbents are already doing a lot of things here. They're getting comfortable with this. They're using it not only for the crypto, but also the applications of the technology. We see central banks doing central banks digital currencies, and a lot of exchanges moving into this space. The reason I'm saying all this is that there's a lot of value on the underlying technology, and the banks are keen to participate. So the unbanked principle of the Bitcoin, it's actually coming back to the banking system. There's some capital implications of using this more widely, then that's probably why we are not seeing a ramp up of the traditional banks from using crypto more often. What I think, and the process we experienced, was how do you get comfortable in participating in this space? And there's a lot of governance that you need to put around it. We had to create risk committees, making sure that the new risks were understood, the risk assessment that Graham probably had to fill in to be a regulated exchange. We had to do it when we set up Zodiac Custody and Zodiac Markets, and also for the bank itself to participate in some of these things. So these are lengthy processes, and it needs to be bought by different people within the organization. So it's not only if senior managers want to do it, there's a governance structure around it, and the compliance, the IT, the business, everyone needs to buy into it, and it takes time. What I found most amazing is we also participated on the Facebook, on the DM currency, and the amount of knowledge that the regulators acquired over 2 years is just huge. And most of the most interesting discussions these days are with the regulators themselves. So I think there's a lot of...
In the UK?
Across the globe, actually. Switzerland, depends on the jurisdictions, but Switzerland, UK, and a few others are ramping up and investing a lot in that space. So I think, going back to your original question, 5 years from now, I don't think we'll probably be very advanced in DAOs, in the DAO space, but we will be using concepts of decentralization more and more, and using that more broadly. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think within 5 years we can anticipate that the use of blockchain and cryptocurrency will be occurring in some instances without us even, the consumer, sort of being aware of the rails or the way that, you know, the financial systems have been able to be updated. To your point, I think banks are more interested in the underlying blockchain technology. When I'm talking about, you know, Silvergate Bank, that's a bank that had committed to banking the exchanges in the US, and when something like FTX happens and there's some sort of turmoil in the industry, that reputational risk comes back on the bank. But yeah, I mean, I think that we're, you know, I am concerned that things are moving offshore from the United States. I hope that in the United States we have some sort of congressional action or clarity legislation that can keep, you know, we can keep clients in the United States and give them advice on how to be regulated and compliant, you know, companies.
So we're T-minus 30, so very short for both of you, and then I'll just...
Yeah, very, very quickly, just on that prior point of banks, it's hard to explain to everyone how much of an issue it is. We're the most regulated digital company in the UK. We currently have 48 bank applications ongoing. I've only ever applied to one bank with far fewer regulations than I've had right now. And to your point earlier, crypto is gambling. That's what the banks think, rather than saying crypto is a technology, what are you doing? And we're mostly doing securities, and everything we do, we follow all the regulation, but people just decline you at the application stage. And unless you're in the office filling in those forms and getting rejection after rejection, it's so hard to point out how impactful that is on your business. So I just wanted to follow up on that other point. In terms of 5 years, what Hailey says is exactly right. You were going to see this everywhere. This is going to be the register of ownership for every asset class that's out there. We're already seeing the asset managers and the banks now starting to look at pretty much every product they have. And I think you're going to start to see these points of inflection where clearinghouses, CSDs, big market infrastructure players turn on a parallel solution, and then you just see this huge swathe of assets start to move on chain.
That's exciting.
I will try to keep this as short as possible, especially because it's dark. And while I try to be a realist, I'm also a pragmatist. And I think in 5 years, you're going to see the fall of the US dollar, the fall of an empire, and the reality of globalization and technology coming. And when you hit somebody with one punch, they don't go down. But when 20 countries, 30 countries, the level of partnership that you're seeing, the guy from MAS at Innovate talked about this, countries that have never partnered before, countries that have never talked before, that are building together and are seeing the future of digital assets, that a lot of folks in the United States, because the nature of our reactive, not proactive, massive aircraft carrier government doesn't move very fast. And what's going to happen is going to be wildly disruptive for the entire world, in the sense that all of these countries that previously had to bow to the US dollar, when the US dollar is no longer the hegemonic, the currency for the globe, because now you've created a currency that can be transmitted instantly for pennies on the dollar to anyone, anywhere. The reality of that playing out is, if the US does not change where they're going, all of these countries that see the future of digital assets, that see the puzzle piece that is digital identity, that sees the puzzle piece that is crypto, blockchain technology, Web3, all of these things coming together, and wants to be there for what's essentially like the next internet, you can lose that war. And if the US loses that war, what the world looks like in 5 years will not necessarily bad. It will just be like nothing that we've ever seen. And that's what I think will happen.
So that's very interesting. We're almost done. I'm just going to say this. I'm not quite as pessimistic. So I want to end on a happier note, because I think there are a lot. There's actually there may be some good momentum. I do think that the U.S., we eventually get it right. We will get it right. I think also the fact that you have stable coins being denominated in U.S. dollars, that will perhaps offset the partnerships and the CBDCs and all the other arrangements. So I want to thank my panelists, fabulous panelists. Thank